this wait-and-see approach and further talks with the Allies. So for the President, a foreign policy triumph that almost fell in his lap, and for the media, massive coverage of what may be the end of 70 years East-West ideological struggle.
Gone. A remarkable week in the history of the world.
The most important week in the Soviet Union since the 1917 revolution.
And on a wry note, a Detroit hotel welcomes Gorby back, but suggests that next time he vacations in Michigan. Wesley Kerr, BBC News, Washington.
Well, this morning in Moscow, they're burying the 3 people who died during the demonstrations on Tuesday. We've got some pictures coming in at this moment from Moscow, I think. Here we are, and Mr. Gorbachev is addressing the crowds there. We're going to listen to what he says, because we have Alex Pravda, who will tell us something of the flavour of the speech that he's giving. This is a general view. We're not being told where he's speaking, and that's the end of his speech. Now we have another speaker. And there's the crowd, looking very large indeed. I think that's in the centre of Moscow, not very far from Red Square. And a solemn moment, a very, very quiet crowd after all the excitement, after the tremendous noise and hubbub of recent days. It's an enormous crowd, very quiet. We're now seeing, I think, Elena Bonner, I think. Andrei Sakharov's widow is now speaking to the crowd, being heard in respectful silence. Of course, only a few years ago she was in exile with her husband. A remarkable demonstration of how much things have changed in the USSR. Live pictures from Moscow this morning of the funerals of the 3 people who died in the course of the events of the last few days. And now a look at today's front pages, dominated, of course, by the 5th day of events in the Soviet Union. The Second Revolution reads The Guardian's headline. At the end of the most revolutionary week in Russia since 1917, the paper says the future of the entire Soviet Union is in doubt.
In common with several other papers, Today changed its lead during the night. In its first edition, it used a one-word headline, humbled. In its later edition, the word changed to finished. Mr. Gorbachev says Today was emasculated in the course of an act of gripping political theatre.
According to the Telegraph, communism was sunk by Yeltsin, but there is a danger, the Telegraph warns, that disorder will break out on a scale Mr. Yeltsin will be unable to control.
Gorbachev suffers humiliation at the hands of Yeltsin is the Financial Times headline. Yesterday, it described as, without doubt, the worst day in the history of the Communist Party.
For the Daily Mail, Boris Yeltsin is now first among equals, but for both President Gorbachev and the Communist Party, the political future is short-lived.
The hardline Communist daily, the Morning Star, has a particular interest in events in Moscow. Its headline, Yeltsin hammers the communists. The paper speaks of a witch hunt against millions of communists who supported perestroika. This persecution, the Morning Star says, must stop.
On the inside pages, there are some telling vignettes. The Times diary describes how the Soviet ambassador to Ireland, who a few days ago had declared the coup as quite constitutional, was now delighted Mr. Gorbachev was back. It was all a regrettable misunderstanding, a spokesman for the embassy said.
There are many pages of analysis. John Lloyd of the Financial Times writes that for the Russian people, this coup has been like a passion play, purging the soul and countering the despair of the last years of perestroika.
The commentators are unsparing of Mikhail Gorbachev. Angus Roxburgh of The Guardian says he looked like a frightened rabbit in the hands of Yeltsin, who saved him from the communist wolves, but who could still skin him alive if he chose.
And the Telegraph reports the efforts of Leonid Kravchenko, the sacked head of Soviet television, to plead innocence. His excuse that the sad music played on television during the coup between statements from the leadership was a form of protest. Well, in the past 2 days, Boris Yeltsin's political fortunes have... I'm sorry, it's 8:17 now. We must just catch up with the latest headlines. You're watching this morning's BBC Breakfast News. The Soviet Communist Party is trying to distance itself from last week's coup. It's complained about anti-communist hysteria. In Moscow, more symbols of communist power have been demolished. And in the Baltic states, there's growing optimism that independence is within sight. Well, as I began by saying, in the past 2 days, Boris Yeltsin's political fortunes have changed beyond recognition. The man who recently wrote that he does not covet Mr. Gorbachev's job is now only a heartbeat away from it. Yeltsin is the elected president of the Russian Federation, but the pact forged between himself and Mikhail Gorbachev makes him his automatic successor as president of the Soviet Union if he cannot carry out his duties. Since the coup, Mr. Yeltsin has signed many decrees. Some critics say too many for a man devoted to democratic reform. Kent Barker examines Boris Yeltsin's position.
It wasn't just a dramatic gesture of defiance. Boris Yeltsin was also scrambling up the political hierarchy of the Soviet Union. His outspoken opposition to the coup transformed him in the moment from a regional to a national politician. Rule by decree may be a time-honored method of governance in the Russias, but some have been surprised just how rapidly Boris Yeltsin acquired the knack. With President Gorbachev apparently following meekly in his wake, Boris Yeltsin ignored protocol, making senior central government appointments and conducting a wholesale purge of the communist media.
The measures which have been announced by Mr. Yeltsin today are not exactly liberal measures. Suppression of newspapers with which he disagrees, suppression of political activity of various kinds. It is the beginning of the imposition of a populist dictatorship.
The most dramatic manifestation of the Yeltsin consolidation of power came during the question and answer session which followed President Gorbachev's address to the Russian parliament. Comrades, he said, as a diversion, allow me to sign a decree halting the activity of the Russian Communist Party. So the suspension of the Communist Party was ordered pending an investigation into alleged conspiracy with the coup. Boris Yeltsin also issued decrees outlawing party cells in the Russian Republic's armed forces, the KGB and the Interior Ministry. Then, encroaching on President Gorbachev's territory, he announced the appointment of new Central Soviet ministers and KGB head. Boris Yeltsin then announced the dismissal of the head of the TASS news agency and the state broadcasting organization. The main newspapers of the Communist Party, including Pravda, were also suspended by Yeltsin for what his decree described as propaganda for acts aimed at overthrowing the constitutional system. The Director General of TASS and his counterpart at the Novosti news agency were alleged to have been accomplices of the coup d'etat. In Britain, the London correspondent of TASS heard the news via the BBC. He questions whether Boris Yeltsin had the authority to order the dismissals.
It's a constitutional matter, and the Director General of TASS news agency was appointed by the President of the USSR. So I think the President of the USSR should dismiss our Director General if he wishes to.
While Boris Yeltsin was extending his authority with dismissals and appointments nationally, he was also tightening his grip at home in the Russian Republic.
He is a man, obviously, of authoritarian temperament. He is supported by a great wave of popular sentiment, which is not going to incline him to moderation in the least.
If Western leaders felt they could do business with Mr. Gorbachev, will they feel the same about the man who looks set to rival him?
Well, joining us now from Moscow is Professor Lele Shevtsova, who is director of the Center for Policy Studies there and an advisor to the Russian Parliament. Here in the studio also is Dr. Alex Pravda. Well, I'm going to turn to you first of all, if I may, Alex Pravda. Is the Communist Party, we're writing its obituary, is it finished now?
It's the beginning of the end of the party, certainly, because in the major centres, buildings are being closed up, papers disbanded. What is left now is a huge network of provincial party organizations, and the people who man those organizations are now, of course, thinking very hard whether to jump ship very quickly indeed and get out before they're actually forced out. But as a political force in the Soviet Union, as a leading force, the party is finished.
We aren't completely underestimating the party, are we? After all, it does permeate the whole of the life of the Soviet Union, and we've seen what the people of Moscow and Leningrad think. But of course, there are millions of people who don't live in those two cities who, according to recent elections, do still feel some support, some affection for the party.
Perhaps affection, affiliation, but also vested interest and power. There are about 14 million people still left in the Communist Party. It used to have 20 million people in it. And it was really a state organization. It wasn't really a political party as we would know it. It was the political establishment. And what Yeltsin is doing, and what the people who are demonstrating in Moscow are doing, are actually challenging the existing political establishment in the Soviet Union and its organizational structure.
Can I turn to the position of Yeltsin? People are beginning now to express fears. He is in an extraordinarily powerful position. Is he unchallengeable? Is there a danger that without any kind of checks and balances, his regime could be in its way as intolerant as that of the communists that it replaces?
Intolerance is a possibility, but more dangerous is the fact that people in the Soviet Union tend, because of the nature of the system, to turn from one leader or one organization to another. The alternative is now Yeltsin. Everyone's for Yeltsin. And that's unhealthy. I think what's better and what might emerge is a kind of pluralism.
Well, unhealthy. Let's put that to Professor Lela Shevtsova, who I hope is in our Moscow studio. And alas, no, she is not. So let me stay with you, Alex Pravda. Mikhail Gorbachev, he has been an extremely important figure in the recent history of the USSR. Is his role now over?
He was in some ways perhaps always fated to be a transitional figure, a transitional leader, but the transition was absolutely crucial. He must be given full credit for beginning the whole process of reform from above and allowing some degree of reform from below and pressure from below to come. He seems to have reached the limits of what he wants to achieve and what he wants to allow to happen. He seems to be very reluctant to condone a non-communist and anti-communist regime and a really revolutionary movement in the Soviet Union and harness it and work with it.
But in terms of providing the reformed Russia with a balanced political leadership, might it be useful not to have him there as an alternative power center to Yeltsin and his people?
It's useful to have somebody like Gorbachev who represents a more consensus view, perhaps a more moderate view of how things might go forward, and who has a great concern to bring as many people into a consensus as possible. Yeltsin, on the other hand, is also a necessary figure because he's taken the bold steps, the radical gestures, which Gorbachev would not have taken.
Thank you very much, Alex Pravda, and I hope later we shall be able to hear from Professor Lela Shevtsova in Moscow.
In Mr. Gorbachev's words, the Union has a real problem of survival. One by one, the republics are preparing to go their own way. The new Union Treaty was to have been signed last Tuesday. Valerie Sanderson reports.
The writing is on the wall for the old guard. Communism may be in its death throes, but it's given birth to a new kind of Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union has 15 republics made up of 280 million people. The largest are the Ukraine and Russia, the focus of anger against this week's abortive coup. The smallest are the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, which have pressed home their claim for independence. And there are the 5 Central Asian republics. These are Muslim states. Distant from Moscow, they've been relatively docile under the Soviet yoke, accepting direct control from the center. Only 2 republics publicly supported the coup, the Muslim Republic of Uzbekistan and the Transcaucasian Republic of Azerbaijan. After the Azerbaijani leadership came out in support of the coup, hundreds of people took to the streets, demonstrating against the putsch. Now the tensions between those who supported the communist regime and those who opposed it have fueled the ethnic tensions that already exist.
All the scores will be settled. Nationalists will be trying to take advantage. Muslim fundamentalists will be coming out. Remember that these nations feel oppressed by 70 years of communism, which until now they have seen as Russian nationalism. And ironically, it's now Russian nationalism that's trying to liberate them in the form of Boris Yeltsin's Russia.
Boris Yeltsin has proved to be a role model for many of the leaders of the republics. Yesterday, Kazakhstan's President Nazarbayev, who was also head of the communists there, resigned from the ruling Politburo, denouncing its role in the plot to overthrow Gorbachev. Yeltsin has now pushed Gorbachev to concede even more autonomy than the original Union Treaty envisaged. It's independence that the Central Asian republics will gain, but at a price.
With the Soviet Union going to become much more of a confederation, insofar as it survives at all, there'll be much fewer resources going from Russia to the Central Asian republics. So they're the ones that will lose the most.
But it appears to be a price worth paying for the prospect of independence.
Well, joining us now, I hope, from Moscow is Professor Lela Shevtsova of the Center for Policy Studies. I hope I've got the name of the organization right, an advisor to the Russian government. Professor Shevtsova, some concern has been expressed here in London about the unchallenged position of Boris Yeltsin. There seems to be a concern there could be a danger that in his way, without anyone to check him, he could become as intolerant as perhaps the communists in the past have been.
Well, you see, of course, there are a lot of dangers looming before us, but if we'll talk about Boris Yeltsin, he has a tremendous popularity at the moment, and he has political legitimacy for the first time in our history, the unique political legitimacy in the history of the Soviet Union and of the Russia too. But of course, there is a danger of the sort that political legitimacy and popularity does not mean exactly success in the office.
Do you think that the new ministers that he's been appointing are men who are strong enough to act as a check to him, to his own enormous power at the moment?
Well, the ministers that have been appointed are known as people of democratic convictions, and especially the Minister of Interior, the Chief of KGB, and of course the deputies of new Minister of Defense. But of course the fight will be going on over the appointments of other appointments, because it will be meant to be a coalition government, and other republics want to have their representatives in the government. And to speak frankly, I don't think that at the moment present the coalition government is the best solution for us, because every republic will be going to just force to push forward its own interests. Of course there is a danger in this sense.
Are you saying that the need now is for a very strong leadership, perhaps, in the Soviet Union?
Well, it's a very interesting moment to discuss, because we have a new page in our history. The majority of functions, the power itself, the bulk of the power will be transferred to the republic. And in the center will be more or less with mild functions. And you see, the fight will be going on what to give to the center, but it will be a new phase. It will be republics that will be transferring power to the center, but not on the
Can
country.
I ask you one brief last question, Professor Shevtsova? Is it the case, as we are saying here in London, that the Communist Party is now finished, a spent force?
Well, it seems to be really, it's the end of the life of the Communist Party. It's the funeral of communism. But communism can take different shapes, national, populistic, and the people that are now escaping from the Communist Party structures are trying to find their place under the sun. So the moment of truth is before us.
As you say, Professor Shevtsova, we are living in interesting times. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
It's now 8:30 and we'll return to events in the Soviet Union in a few minutes, but now some of this morning's other news. Yugoslavia's troubles are growing. Federal leaders have again failed to agree on measures to stop the intense fighting in Croatia. After a meeting in Belgrade, one member of the 8-man presidency appealed for the immediate deployment of European community observers. Croatian forces say that during 2 days of fighting, they've advanced on several fronts and killed up to 200 Serb militants. The heaviest attack was near the town of Sisak, south of Zagreb. Serbian leaders have accused the Croats of carrying out massacres of innocent civilians.
The United Nations has released photographs of Iraq's so-called supergun, which was found in mountains north of Baghdad. Iraqi officials told the UN inspectors that the 170-foot gun had been test-fired on 7 occasions, but never with actual shells. At another site, inspectors saw large steel tubes, which experts say, if assembled, would have been the largest artillery weapon in the world.
Wall Street closed last night on a record high, partly encouraged by the failure of the coup in Moscow. The Dow average finished 33 points up on 3,040. The dollar also strengthened. A government report that orders for durables like cars and refrigerators were up 10% reinforced hopes that the American economy was emerging from recession.
Sarah Thornton, who's been on hunger strike in Holloway Prison, has abandoned her 3-week fast. She says she was persuaded to resume eating after her 12-year-old daughter Louise said she did not want to see her die. Mrs. Thornton, who was given a life sentence for killing her violent husband, went on hunger strike in an attempt to have her case referred to the Court of Appeal. The Home Secretary refused to intervene.
And very briefly, today's weather at the start of the bank holiday. Most places will be dry today with some sunshine, but there will be some rain in parts of western and northern Scotland and the far southwest. It's 8:32. Welcome if you've just joined us. This is a special edition of BBC's Breakfast News. The headlines on events in the Soviet Union this morning. The Soviet Communist Party is trying to defend itself and distance itself from the coup. President Bush says developments in the Soviet Union are very positive, a manifestation of people power. The details now from Paul.
Well, we are actually not going to go to Carol Walker. We've got some live pictures coming in of the funerals in Moscow of the 3 people who died. We've seen earlier President Gorbachev addressing the funeral. We're now seeing another speaker. I can't identify him. An enormous crowd there, impressively quiet dignity, a great many of the flags, the Russian flags there, not a single hammer and sickle in sight. A very quiet occasion, understandably, after the hubbub, the noise and the clamour of the last few days. We think this is fairly near to Red Square. I'm not absolutely sure of the location. We aren't quite able to spot it, but that's the scene this morning in Moscow.
Well, President Gorbachev has admitted to a number of crucial mistakes. He's accepted the criticism that the organisers of the coup had been all appointed by him. But this is just one of a number of political misjudgments now being attributed to him. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jeremy Bowen reports.
Gorbachev may have survived the conservative coup, but he now faces the very real prospect of being swept away by Yeltsin's radicals. Since he came to power as Soviet party boss in 1985, Gorbachev has tried to play off both sides. But he made a series of potentially fatal mistakes over the years. The economy collapsed as Gorbachev failed to develop a coherent economic plan. The old system was shaken up, but nothing replaced it, and the food queues have got worse. His popularity plummeted, and Gorbachev made a crucial mistake by ducking the opportunity to gain a popular mandate. He declined to submit himself to an election as president, choosing to be voted in by the Soviet parliament. And he lost the authority he might have gained from winning a nationwide election. Gorbachev has always been popular abroad for allowing the breach of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. But in Moscow, the hardliners were angry. The empire had been given away. Under threat, Gorbachev abandoned plans for radical reforms and last December threw in his lot with the conservatives. Eduard Shevardnadze, his foreign minister, resigned, warning that his boss might be toppled. But Gorbachev ignored him and brought more conservatives into the government, including 2 of the men who were to betray him, the Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov and the former Interior Minister Boris Pugo. Gorbachev's long-standing ally, Alexander Yakovlev, tried repeatedly to persuade him to leave the party, and just 3 days before the coup, Yakovlev also warned about the dangers of dictatorship. As he returned to Moscow from his home in the Crimea, President Gorbachev made a crucial mistake. He didn't go to the Russian parliament to thank the people for defending democracy and for saving him. Instead, he went off to see his advisors. Then, at his press conference, he astonished the audience by saying he'd revive the reviled Communist Party, the very party that was being blamed for the coup.
He's making a last desperate bid to save the brain of the body politic. I think he knows better than anybody else that if the brain dies, then the body dies afterwards.
On the streets of Moscow, the party is clearly finished. Gorbachev is out of step. He can't grasp how much has changed over the past 6 days. Only yesterday, during his humiliating appearance at the Russian parliament, Gorbachev had to agree to sack the conservatives he'd appointed the day before. He now faces the real danger that, like moderates before him, he'll be swept away by the pressures his own reforms have unleashed.
Well, joining me now is our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jeremy Bowen. Jeremy, Boris Yeltsin is the president of the Russian Federation. Do you think he has the support of the whole of the Soviet Union now, over and above Gorbachev?
I certainly think that Gorbachev is increasingly unpopular and Yeltsin's support is growing. He's building very successfully on the power base the events of the last week have given him. One thing that's very important to grasp, I think, at the moment about politics in the Soviet Union is the kind of pattern we're seeing now in Moscow is really a repetition of what's happened, obviously, on a much smaller scale in republics, say the Baltics, particularly the Baltics. A year ago, the year before, politics have moved out of the smoke-filled rooms and onto the streets. Yeltsin's a master at manipulating that, and Gorbachev doesn't really know where to begin.
Where does this leave the Union Treaty now? Perhaps a very changed one to the one that was due to be signed on Tuesday.
It could well be. I think the trends within the Union Treaty, which tended to loosen the bonds within the Soviet Union, are probably going to increase. It's obviously going to be a priority to get that signed, though.
Jeremy, for the moment, thank you very much.
Well, the Soviet Communist Party is quite clearly in deep crisis this morning. Boris Yeltsin has suspended the party's operations in Russia. In Latvia and Lithuania, the party has been banned altogether. Estonia and Moldavia have imposed tight restrictions on its activities. It is 74 years since the birth of Soviet communism. Charlie Lee Potter assesses what finally went wrong.
The communist revolutionaries of 1917, under Lenin's leadership, trumpeted that power was the people's. But power became the scourge to be wielded by a few. Stalin's communist vision was to create a new industrial society, to force people off the land and into factories. But Stalin's scheme relied on torture, death and hunger. An analysis of the damage done in the name of communism has his work at its head.
Perhaps the biggest single item is the deaths of at least 20 million people during the purges and the industrialization and the collectivization in the 1930s. But broader than this, it has locked Soviet society into an inefficient system, which is economically, politically, and to some extent even socially, which has now got into a downward spiral, and from which it will be extremely difficult to pull it out.
It was impossible to function without the party. It controlled newspapers and television. It governed factories and farms. For the communist elite, the party was synonymous with power and privilege. Membership brought secluded dachas, and it brought the consumer goods, luxuries, denied to the rest of the people. But even for the party's most vehement opponents, there was once good reason to belong.
When the party was the party of government, when it had the strength that it did have, it was very important that good people stay in the party and prevent it from being taken over by the right, but now the party doesn't exist anymore.
The poverty of so many Soviet citizens is a constant taunt to the ideology which was supposed to prevent the exploitation of one man by another. And if there's now no need to belong to the party, either for material or political gain, its swift demise seems inevitable.
Right, joining me now in the studio is Dr. Raya Simonian, head of the Moscow Institute for World Economy and International Relations, and in Moscow, Dr. Andrei Piankovsky, who is an advisor to Boris Yeltsin. What is crucial now, Mr. Piankovsky, is what President Yeltsin does about the economy. How quickly can we begin to see, in economic terms, his accession, effective accession to power, begin to bear fruit?
Not very quickly, but it's very important for us to break off this totalitarian communist system, which blocked all effective economic reform for many years. I think now we're just 2 years behind East European countries.
Can I turn to that question of breaking the influence of the Communist Party? Up until now, the Communist Party has effectively provided the nervous system for the whole of Soviet society. Without it there to act in that role, what will replace it?
Well, the events of latest days showed that there is an established structure of democratic movement in Soviet Union and established structure of executive power in Russian Republic, headed by a democratically elected president. And I assure you that this system will prove much more effective than the communist system.
Andrei Piankovsky, Moscow, thank you very much indeed. Let me turn now to Dr. Raya Simonian. We heard Mr. Piankovsky there saying it would be a while before we began to see this change, this shift in the balance of power bear fruit. What do you expect to see to be the first signs of change?
You see, the first signs of change will be determination of the leaders to implement the reforms, not just to make the statements and political declarations, but do something practical.
When we see words replaced by actions?
Yes, sure. And you see, one of the first actions might be the privatization, large-scale privatization.
Dr. Raya Simonian, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Well, that's all from this edition of BBC Breakfast News. Good morning.
Well, Desmond Lynam will be firing the grandstand starting pistol in a couple of minutes, launching a packed agenda, including world athletics, test cricket, European swimming and racing. First on BBC One, let's see if the weather's going to give the cricketers at Lord's a sporting chance. Here's Michael Fish.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you. Indeed it is. What a difference a day makes, doesn't it? Just look at this behind me. Clear blue skies virtually here in London. and a very different day in store just about for the whole country, and a promise of some fine weather to come for the rest of the weekend and into Monday. But back to Lords, well, today I think we're going to find a reasonable temperature there, about 23 degrees, some sunshine from time to time, a gentle southwesterly breeze, and the same is true for the racing at Goodwood. Further afield for the international athletics at Tokyo, well, quite hot and sticky, I think, more than anything. 32 degrees there. That's very hot indeed, up towards about 90 or so. And it should stay dry and fairly bright. But let's come back closer to home, and we've had a complete change take place during the course of the night. Yesterday, you may recall, we had a nasty area of low pressure across the country. In complete contrast today, an area of high pressure. And indeed, much of the cloud has moved on to the continent. We still have a little bit of a sort of swathe of cloud across western parts at the moment, but it's going to continue to break up as the day wears on. But to begin with, in those western parts, even stretching right away through the Bristol Channel and coming up the M4, we have a fair amount of cloud, and just here and there 1 or 2 spots of light rain and drizzle. But as I said, that cloud should tend to break up during the course of the day, and although there will be cloud everywhere floating over from time to time, we're all going to have a dry day, we're all going to have much lighter winds, and there'll be some sunshine from time to time. 1 or 2 lightish showers might continue to affect the north and west of Scotland, and a little bit of cloud could come into the Channel Islands and the far southwest late on in the day, bringing with it the odd spot of drizzle. But temperatures are up on yesterday's as well. We're going to see about 22 degrees in places. That's not far off the normal for the time of year. Tonight, the cloud that has formed during the day will break up. 1 or 2 mist and fog patches perhaps towards the end of the night, and the odd light shower still near those western coasts, and a pleasant enough night as far as the temperatures are concerned. Now tomorrow, that high pressure well and truly on the scene, in control of the weather, so it's going to be a dry day virtually everywhere, a reasonable amount of sunshine, and if anything, turning out to be warmer than today. We could well get up to 24 degrees, for instance, in the southeast. And then, of course, for Monday, well, for most people, it's a bank holiday, so it's good news to see that high pressure still there in command, and indeed, I think come Monday, we'll see temperatures as high as 25, the exception the far northwest, where it'll be a bit on the breezy side with a few spots of rain. And that's it. A very good day to you.